This video is going to go up ways that we can set up experimental research projects, and we're going to focus in particular on two different types that we encountered in the reading this week, and that is between and within subjects designs. So when it comes to designing an experiment, there's many ways that you could go about it depending on what you're doing. So how do you know what kind of setup to use? In experimental studies, it depends on what you're doing. So there are different ways to group your participants. It depends on how you administer your interventions and how you're generating data from your participants. And that's all driven by your phenomenon of interest and your research questions and your theoretical framework in terms of what decisions you should be making in terms of your design. So if I think learning is a gradual process that's happening over time, and I want to capture that, that's the key, I want to also be capturing that, then I want to probably get several data points from the beginning to the end of whatever, I don't know, intervention I'm doing. This is what we would call a time series design. We're not going to talk about that today, mainly because it didn't happen in the reading that we did, but it's something that you might encounter as you're doing your own research for projects and in the future, where essentially they are just collecting many data points over time for all of their participants. So that could be an easy way you can do this as a teacher is doing, little daily quizzes or weekly quizzes across a module to see your students change in their understanding. That is more or less a time series design where you're getting multiple data points and you're looking at all of your data points over time. Now, if I just want to show that my new curriculum works, I might only need a pre and post test design as my main data source. So I could do a quasi-experimental if I'm doing it at kind of, a smaller scale where I can't randomly sort students into different classrooms. You can also do it as a true experimental design. This would be a large scale study where your random choice or random selection is probably happening at a school level. So what schools are getting to participate in which condition. Um, but for the most part, we do a lot of quasi-experimental design to do curriculum tests because we can just do pre and post test with the classes that got the curriculum, the classes that didn't get the curriculum. And as a refresher, the quasi-experimental means that we just couldn't randomly select participants. So it doesn't mean it's not a valid experiment, it just means that we were probably constrained to where students already were in terms of a classroom or school setup. So now we're going to talk about between and within subjects design. And the second article in their methods tells us that they did a between and a within subjects design, which you can do both at the same time. But what does that actually mean? So between subjects means that I am comparing a whole experimental group, usually, to a whole control group. I might have multiple groups, but two is, the bare minimum you need to do this study. So we can look at this table where I've got letters A through H, imagine that they are people, participants, in the control group, and then I have I through P in the experimental group. So they are getting distinct experiences in my experiment. Say I'm doing a curriculum study. Control group is probably getting the already established curriculum. The experimental group is getting the new curriculum that we're testing out. So when I run this study, I will have two sets of data to be able to compare performance in, but they're all different people. Now, if I'm doing within subjects, I end up using the same participant as their own control, so I'm comparing their data before and after my intervention. So everybody in my study is getting the intervention. So comparing this table that just popped up to the previous one, you might notice that all of the letters appear twice. There's, X in the pretest row and X in the post-test row. So in this case, I am using each person as their own control, their pretest, and then I can do my intervention, whatever it is, and get their post-test score. And then I can compare if there's any difference in score. Now, there's benefits to both of these studies. So control group, the between subjects design gives you a dedicated control group. it could be a constraint on your experiment that you just don't have time to be doing a pre-test, post-test design, and so you can do a control group and an experimental group, get their performance at the end of an exam, and there you go. You have the data that you could use to compare, your experimental group to control group. Pre-test or the within subjects design in the case of this, pre-test, post-test example could be really handy if you don't have a lot of people to do your study with. So you might notice that within the between subjects table, we go all the way to letter P. So there's 16 people there. In the within subjects, we technically only have the one row of people. We're just getting 2 different data points from them. So we really only have, let's see, in this case, 10 participants, but we're getting 20 data points because they do a pre-test and a post-test. So it can really depend on the constraints you have in terms of who you have access to, how long you have access to them. The other, I wouldn't say constraint, but it goes back to, okay, what is it you're trying to research, and if there's anything you need to control for, this can also impact your design. If you think there might be a really important factor that a person's ability before the intervention might impact how they experience the intervention, you might want to do with a within subjects, because you can then control for the person's prior experience, because whatever participant X is scoring on their pretest over here isn't going to affect how I look at participant Y, because I'm looking only at participant Y's comparison. So often there's a little bit of a mix of both that's happening in studies, so you can do, between subjects design with your control and experimental group, and also do pre-test, post-test within both your control and an experimental group. So it's not exclusive. These are just different ways that data can be compared and collected in your study. So, as I say a lot, depending on what you're studying, you might want to do both. You might want to do one or the other. It depends on what's going to work best for your study. And in the case of our reading, they were doing another thing that we're going to talk about in a second, which was testing for an order effect. So did it matter which format a person read first? Was it an impact of reading it digitally first or reading it on paper first? Did that make a difference in what the student's performance was? So okay, so now we're going to look at counterbalance design, and this is something that researchers use when they think the order of doing something matters. And conveniently, in the article that we read, they gave us this table over here that gives us the condition and how the basically it just details the order at which a person experienced the digital or the paper version of the reading and then got switched to the other version in the second part. So in condition A, the participants that were in here read on paper first for part 1, and then they switched to digital for part 2. And then in condition B, they did the reverse. So they got digital for part 1, and they got paper for part 2. So we can look at this table to see how the study is both a within and between subjects design, like they tell us. So it's between subjects because we are comparing condition A and condition B's post-test scores. So does it matter that you read on paper first versus reading digitally first in terms of what you did on your post-test? And it's also within subjects because they looked at the change within each condition, particularly for what the behavior of the person was doing in terms of highlighting and going back and reviewing. So did that matter? Did your behavior change when you were on paper? So were you highlighting more on paper than when you switched to digital? And you can do that in both conditions because both conditions, whether or not you were in condition A or condition B, you got exposed to both the digital and the paper. So you could see if there was a difference between when they were doing digital reading versus paper reading in terms of their behavior. So we have between subjects because we have 2 conditions, and you didn't swap between conditions. But we are also within subjects because we are looking at data points from the same person in the conditions. So a person who is in condition B, we could compare to somebody in condition A on their post-test score, and we're also looking at when person in condition B was reading digitally, did they highlight more or less than when they were reading on paper? So we have multiple data sources or data points that they're collecting for participants, and they're getting compared in different ways. And one last quantitative thing that I wanted to make sure was clear, just because I don't remember if we called this a dummy variable before. We have encountered this before when we're thinking about regressions and things like that, but often you will see this called a dummy variable, and that is just a term for when they are creating a numerical value for something categorical. So we've seen this before. We can think about if we were collecting, data on a person's sex, we would, ask them male or female. We wouldn't ask them 0 or 1. That would be weird, and they wouldn't know what we were talking about. So we would ask them with the words, and they would indicate to us with the words that we give them. Then when we're going to do analysis, we turn the word into a number. And so this is actually what I did as well for our project, where when we had the gender row or column, I went through and changed those to 0 and 1 so that I could run statistics on them and create those graphs. And we do this for not just gender too. It doesn't have to be binary. We can do it for essentially any variable that we would use verbal descriptors as our different categories. We then convert into numbers. So we might use 1, 2, and 3 to represent low, medium, and high socioeconomic status. So it really depends. But anytime we are seeing a quantitative study that has collected a demographic variable that is categorical, they will be doing this to use this data in their analysis. So they're not using the words, they're using numbers. And so you might see them explicitly say that they've dummy coded a variable or they've created a dummy variable. It just means that the zeros and ones don't actually mean anything until you remember what the 0 stands for and what the 1 stands for. That's all that's about. So nothing new in the sense that we have seen analyses use these kinds of things before, but that was a new term that I wanted to make sure I covered because it may be something you see again, if not already in your own research.